We're in Acts chapter 17. We're going to start in verse 16. This is Paul has left another small part of the group in Thessalonica and Berea. Now he's moved on down to Athens. And Athens was a hotbed of culture. It was one of the most beautiful cities in the empire. Lots of folks would take their vacations to go to Athens, and I guess they still do. It's still a tourist attraction for people to go, and some of the same reasons. There is the Acropolis, which is a place where the ancient temples were built, temple to Athena, temple to Zeus, all up on the top of this hill. So from all over town, you could see it. And of course now they have the luxury of lighting it up. So in those days, I'm sure it got dusky dark. You couldn't see all the temples from all over town. But now, it gets dark. It gets even more available to you. But anyway, he went on down to Athens, and he's by himself. And so it's kind of interesting to see how he goes about his ministry. If Paul is left to his own devices and by himself for a little while, what he gets into. And particularly the sermon that he preaches in Athens is one of the more famous of his sermons and one of the more useful as far as just talking to people about God. He opens up some ideas that these folks had not really thought about, and they had thought about just about everything. So I want us to read all the way through this account and then go back and pick it apart. So we'll start in chapter 17, verse 16. Now, while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also conversed with him. Some of them said, "What does this babbler wish to say?" Others said, "He seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities," because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. They took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, "May we know what this new teaching is that you're presenting? For you bring some strange things to our ears. We wish to know, therefore, what these things mean." Now all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there would spend their time in nothing except telling or hearing something new. So Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you're very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, 'To the unknown God.' What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. He made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Yet he's actually not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As even some of your own poets have said, we are indeed his offspring. Being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of man. The times of ignorance God overlooked, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. And of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. Now when they heard of the resurrection from the dead, some mocked, but others said, "We will hear you again about this." So Paul went out from their midst. But some men joined him and believed, and among them were Dionysius the Areopagite, and a woman named Damaris, and others along with them. Run all the way back up to 16. And the first thing that jumped out at me was Paul was provoked. Does that same translation that you have, Paul was provoked in his spirit.
Mine says greatly distressed.
Greatly distressed, yeah. What is it that greatly distresses you about our culture? Is there anything that just jumps off the page at you? Paul's walking around Athens. He's seeing all kinds of things about their culture, and it distresses him. He's provoked. Anything about our culture?
The same thing he was seeing.
The same things, yeah. Just the complete worldliness, the self-centeredness of human beings jumps out at you. And Paul was raised in a culture and among people who were very God-centered. And so all of a sudden he's in this place and they have tons of different gods, but the gods are meant to serve them, not the other way around. You know, you pick a god that fits your agenda. A lot of the guilds in the Roman Empire had their patron god or goddess. The idea was the god or goddess was like them, promoted the things they liked, helped them make more money, helped the guild be more successful, those kinds of things. So you see why Paul would be upset about seeing all of these things. I think probably the only time I can remember being thoroughly provoked, Becky and I were married for 15 years before we went on our honeymoon. And we went on our honeymoon to Las Vegas. And I was provoked. It was the most amazing thing I'd ever seen. You know, even being raised in Dallas, I mean, I was raised in the city, but never saw anything like that. The openness of the debauchery of that place was just amazing to me. But interesting. You know, you kind of get sucked in to watching and seeing all the things that are going on around you and wondering, you know, where did those people come from and how did they get to that place in life? Well, Paul has 3 tiers of outreach that he's doing while he's in Athens. The first one is in the synagogue, which makes perfect sense. If there is a synagogue, Paul's going to go there. So on the Sabbath days, he's going to the synagogue and he's talking to people who are either Jew by birth or devout people, which would be people who were interested in God, maybe not proselytes, but people who were interested in the law and interested in the one true God.
Mine says Gentile.
Both Jew and Gentile?
Jews and with the Gentile worshipers.
Gentile worshipers, okay. Yeah, the folks that had kind of adopted Judaism, but maybe or maybe not, have they bought in and become proselytes. So they're devout in the sense that they follow the system, whether they've completely become part of it or not. And then when he's not at the synagogue, he goes to the marketplace. And I was reading out of the English version, and the word that they use is all those who happen to be there, right? So he's going to the marketplace every day. He's just talking to whoever happens to be there. So the first group is a very specific group, and they're kind of front-loaded, right? They already know the Old Testament, so he could talk to them about Isaiah and Jeremiah and about prophecies concerning Messiah. When he goes to the marketplace, they know nothing. So a completely different group of people, different kind of message that he would have had to share. Now, eventually, he's going to get to the resurrection, right? We know Paul. And if Paul's teaching, Paul's getting to the resurrection eventually, but maybe through a different avenue, maybe different illustrations, different ways of approaching the folks in the marketplace. And then Luke mentions that there were a couple of groups of philosophers who were watching him and trying to figure out what it was that he was teaching. Now, one of the things about Athens is their history in philosophy. It's where Socrates lived. Socrates taught Plato. Plato taught Aristotle. So they were all from that area. It had been about 250, 300 years since that movement. But all of the people in Athens were interested in that kind of thing. And that's why Luke says what they really liked to do in Athens was to just talk about the newest thing. They weren't necessarily dedicated to one particular set of morals. They just wanted to discuss stuff. And so when I was teaching philosophy, I had one of my friends ask me if I thought it was Christian, if it was the right thing for a Christian preacher to teach, that, you know, should you involve yourself at all with the study of philosophy? It's a good question. Christianity and philosophy are not mutually exclusive, but they do take a different pathway. So if you read some of the things that Plato wrote in particular are really interesting in his take on deity. It's interesting, but it's difficult to get to the same conclusion that you and I have by reading Scripture. In fact, philosophers tend to think of themselves as the ones who have all the answers. So if you compare one philosopher to another, they're going to be arguing about who's right about stuff that you just have to wonder, why are you really worried about who's right about that particular thing? One of the philosophers I always enjoyed, his question was, do I exist? And then he finally decided that he existed. And so the next question was, well, do you exist? You know, if maybe I'm the only one. So I think, therefore I am. But do you think, and therefore you are, or do we think, and therefore we are? And we spent 2 full class sessions talking about, are we really here? And you know where we ended up? We pretty much in agreement that yes, we were here. But those kinds of things were important to people. Well, the 2 groups that are following Paul around are the Stoics and the Epicureans. Have you heard about Epicurean philosophy? Epicureans believe that it's pretty much whatever, as long as you please yourself. They don't believe in life after death. It's whatever you do now, please yourself. There's a kind of cooking. In fact, I think there's a cooking show right now called The Epicurean. And, you know, the whole idea is what tastes good, work it out, make yourself happy, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you die. That kind of philosophy. The Stoics were the opposite end of the deal. The Stoics believed that self-control, wisdom, courage, moderation, that was the way life should be lived. So you've got these 2 groups that are polar opposites, both kind of following Paul around. Right? So they got tired of arguing with each other, I guess, and they want to find out what is it that Paul is trying to tell them. And the best they can figure out is that he's teaching some kind of teaching about some kind of foreign god, because his message was resurrection from the dead. So they're getting the point. They're just not quite sure where he's coming from. So they invite him to come up to the hill of Ares, what we call the Areopagus. The Council of Elders met there. And for years I thought this was just a philosophy thing, that, you know, all the philosophers met and shared ideas up there. But really this was kind of the seat of government. Their city elders met up there. They had their meetings. So it's kind of like going to town hall and you see all the names on the table. You know, here are the folks that are going to get together and discuss city issues. That's where they went. They went up to the Areopagus in kind of an open air meeting. It was a high place, so they could see all over town from up there. And particularly if you were on the Areopagus, you were a little lower, but closer in elevation to the hill where all of the temples were. So you could look across and you could see all of these temples lined up. So not only does Paul see little shrines and idols on his way up the hill at the Areopagus, he can look across the little low place to this next big hill over here, and he can see all of the big temples. So when he starts talking to them about the fact that he finds them to be very religious people, you know, I can tell that you're very religious people. He's got lots of evidence. He could just motion and, you know, look at all of these different temples, all of these different shrines that are in the area. So he's got a lot of things that he could talk about. But he only wants to talk about that one shrine. Somebody in Athens had been bright enough or scared enough or whatever you'd have to be, that they paid to erect a shrine at the Areopagus that was meant to honor whoever we missed, to the unknown God. So we're worshiping everybody in the world that we could think of, and maybe we missed somebody. So they put up a shrine to the unknown God. And you have to assume that people were worshiping at that shrine. Right? Folks were going by and maybe leaving money offerings, or maybe leaving flowers, or leaving, sometimes in those days they would leave pottery, just stuff they thought the god might appreciate. So they would go by this shrine, and on the way up, Paul sees the shrine, and the wheels start turning. Holy Spirit starts turning, Says, that'd be a good starting place. Let's just jump off from there. As I was coming up here, I noticed that you're very religious people, and I noticed that you've got that shrine over there to the unknown God. Let me tell you about the unknown God. And so he starts in with this amazing theology. He's not a philosopher, although Paul does kind of mingle some philosophy in his teaching sometimes, but he's a theologian, and he wants to introduce them to this deity that they don't know. And so his main message is the God that you're halfway honoring with this little plaque over here doesn't need you. He doesn't need a temple. He doesn't need you to serve him. He doesn't need you to do anything. He's self-sufficient. It wasn't you who made him. It was he who made you. And I think modern religion could learn a lot from that. When you look especially at Europe, what they did in Europe between, say, 1300 and all the way even up to the present, the edifices that they built, these huge, monstrous cathedrals, and now they're museums. Right? So they were meant in some way to honor God, to honor Christ. But after you've built the huge building, how do you honor God with it? Does he need it? I mean, a blink and it could be gone. Earthquake next week, it's gone. Is God still honored? Is he still holy? Is he still sovereign? He doesn't need your building. So when we talk about how to honor God, Paul says, just remember, it's not about something you can do for him. It's about something he has done for you. So he preaches them this beautiful sermon, and he says he doesn't need to be served by human hands as though he needs anything. He gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. In fact, he made everybody everywhere from the same stock. So you've got that one man, Adam, and from Adam he brings the entirety of humanity. So all of humanity comes from God. All of humanity should be worshiping God. God doesn't need you. You need God. And then eventually he says that at the end of things, God's going to judge everybody. That he created us, he sustains us, and then eventually he will be the one that will judge us. In verse 31, he says he's fixed a day on which he'll judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. And of this he has given us assurance by raising him from the dead. So he never went to the Old Testament. He never said, let's talk about Isaiah, let's talk about Jeremiah, let's talk about the prophets who prophesied about Jesus. I can prove to you that he's the Messiah if you'll just go with me over to the Old Testament and turn to page 43. He never goes over there because these folks don't know from the Old Testament. They're a bunch of Greeks who think they know everything. Paul says, let me tell you about the one you don't know. And when he gets finished telling about them, his punchline is the same punchline that he gives everybody in all occasions. God raised Jesus from the dead. So you need to pay attention because this is the God who created you. This is the God who's going to judge you. And this God has raised Jesus from the dead. When they heard about resurrection from the dead, some of them mocked him, but others said, we want to hear more. Now, we don't get the more. We don't know too much about a congregation formed there. We get a couple of names at the end, but we don't have a whole lot of information about how many might have been worshiping in Athens, or how it had grown, or any of those things. It's just kind of it's just mentioned that there were some folks, and then he moves on. And Luke doesn't give us a lot to go on past that. He gives us two names, and I've always wondered whether Luke knew more names and just didn't feel like it was necessary to make a big list, or whether he only knew these two names. If he asked Paul for the information, he might have only had two names. Have you ever noticed how Paul doesn't remember all the folks that he converts? In 1 Corinthians, he says, now I didn't baptize anybody but you and you. And he goes, oh yeah, I also baptized you. Past that, I don't remember anybody that I baptized. So he may not have remembered enough to tell Luke all the names. But we've got a fellow named Dionysius and a woman named Damaris. And the Dionysius guy was really interesting to me. Do you know who Dionysus was? This was probably his namesake. He was probably named after a pagan god. Dionysus was the god of wine and partying, and he was the patron god of the theater. So, all the wild stuff that was going on in Athens, they would have said Dionysus was their patron god. And so this guy's name is Dionysius, which is a derivative of it. So this guy comes from being named after the god of partying to being part of the early church in Athens. I always wondered what his mom and dad might have been like, that they named him that. Now again, Paul's not going to stay there. Chapter 18, verse 1, after this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. Period. We've done our preaching. We've been to the synagogue. We've been to the marketplace. We've been to the Areopagus. We're moving on to Corinth. It doesn't say that anybody was after him. It was one of the first times that Paul got to just leave town without having somebody chasing him. He just moves on down the coastline to Corinth, and Lord willing, we'll pick him up there next week. Any thoughts, comments? Nope. Okay. See you later.